So yeah, I guess chapter 2, he kind of reiterates some similar, and chapter 2 is relatively short. I don't know how short other chapters are, but it might be one of the shortest chapters in the entire text. But he kind of reiterates some of his arguments about the formation of money and everything, and kind of like you were saying earlier, kind of contradicts himself in a way. Basically, he starts by saying, commodities don't arrive in a market on their own. Unless they're like, I mean, even if they're a farm animal and can walk themselves, it's not like they just like go to the market and say, buy me, right? There needs to be a buyer and a seller for the commodity. And Marx talks, again, like you've been pointing out, that he talks about these roles that people play, not about like the individuals themselves. And then how these roles, so in a marketplace, it's buyer and seller, but then it's also how these roles switch and then often contradict each other. And it could relate to other things in life. What Harvey points out is like we're at the same time we're pedestrians sometimes, and sometimes we're drivers. And like Harvey says, like, oh, when I'm driving, I look at pedestrians and I'm like, oh, these damn pedestrians keep getting in my way. But then when you're a pedestrian, you're like, oh, all these drivers are so crazy, right? So in that way, these roles we could all hold at different times. They often end up contradicting each other. So then, and then that's when Marx kind of contradicts himself in saying that a commodity's value only pertains to the use value that it has for other people in that market of exchange. And then he uses the term, it crystallizes. Money crystallizes out of the process of exchange. And then he says, it's the universal equivalent that we're able to like measure all commodities or all goods by.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of like the main point, right? It's like, even though there was socially necessary labor time that went into the creation of a commodity or service, it doesn't mean squat unless you can actually bring it to a market and somebody finds their use value in it, which is another kind of key concept, that there's a push between the use value and the value of something, right? Because you bring something to a market because you don't have use value in it, but somebody else does. What you're trying to do is exchange the use value of the thing that you have for value, for money, in order to get other use values, right? And that's kind of more into chapter 3 when we start talking about that. But yeah, chapter 2, the process of exchange, is really just kind of pointing out more about why people, I guess, come to a market, or why exchange takes place. And it's because of that reason. We are all trying to get the use values that we need. And in a commodity economy, that happens through exchange, but that it presupposes that somebody out there has to have the use value. If not, you kind of wasted your time. You wasted that socially necessary labor time, and therefore it's not valuable.
Yeah, it's like you were bringing up the example about the spear and all that. Like, oh, if somebody doesn't need a spear, then I need to find somebody that needs a spear in order to get this and this and this and this and then and that, et cetera. And it could go on forever. And that's why that money serves as that universal equivalent in determining exchange value.
Right. It's a necessary invention in order to like facilitate exchange among independent commodity producers. Who, at the same time, they view all of their commodities as equivalent to each other. So they kind of need to express it in some sort of universal form, and that's how money comes about.
So and then he talks about money as a commodity itself, and it having a dual use value. The quote he says is, "The money commodity acquires a dual use value. Alongside its special use value as a commodity, gold, for instance, serves to fill hollow teeth. It forms a raw material for luxury articles, etc. It acquires a formal use value arising out of its specific social function." So to simplify that, the special use value that money has is merely as a commodity. And this is in Marx's view, obviously, what we're talking about. And then and then the formal, so a special use value is the money's use as a commodity, and then the formal use value is its use as a universal equivalent, which is a social function, and is what we as a society kind of give value to it. The obvious, the problem with this argument that people have pointed out is that Marx's analysis is that of metallism, which is the principle that value of money derives from the purchasing power of the commodity, which is based. So like the gold standard, basically. And that money is a commodity, and he doesn't allow that possibility of like fiat non-convertible fiat money that's divorced from gold and silver that kind of ended in the 70s under Nixon in the U.S. at least. And you kind of pointed out that there wasn't. I mean, there still was like a little like some fiat money during Marx's time, but I guess he doesn't even like consider that a possibility.
Yeah, like I'm going to try to see if I find it in the actual Capital here while I'm talking. But during that time period, even in ancient times, I think in China there was some sort of fiat money. So the idea of paper money existed.
So it's what the government or society, gives value to it without it being backed by gold or anything like that.
Right. And I think even in Capital, I wish I'd marked it. He does mention it. He does mention, banknotes and the idea of paper money. But he always goes back to the idea that it's backed up by gold. It's backed up by something. So he had an understanding of like, okay, we're not. He talks about it. When he's talking about gold and silver as a form of money, he's not talking about people running around with like pieces of gold and like doing that. He understands like, hey, like obviously in order to facilitate exchange, which he gets much more into in chapter 3, which we won't discuss here. You need some sort of easy way to exchange these things. So, you can have in the form of banknotes or coins or something else. But he is very much a metalist, or as you said, this is still with the idea that money is backed up by some sort of vault somewhere with gold in it. And these are just representations of that. Which obviously these are kind of like the parts where, especially in chapter 3, where I kind of glossed over because I was like, all right, obviously this doesn't really have much relevance for our time. But yeah, it's still important to point out that, in this sense, we need to take Marx's understanding of monetary policy, monetary economy with a grain of salt because of that idea that he's a metalist. And hopefully in the future books that we read, which are much more modern, Hudson's work and Keynes' work, whatever that, and Stephanie Kelton's work, The Deficit Myth, when we get there, that'll be much more up to date with how money actually works. So I'm not super interested in Marx's kind of monetary theory, to be honest, because it's kind of outdated and it doesn't really work. But but yeah, I do want to come back really quickly before we go we finish off, I guess, to this concept of fetishism. And there is one little quote that's a little long, but I'm going to read it because I think we can kind of expand on it.
Really quick about the dual use value of money and that formal use value that is socially determined. It kind of also goes back to where he's talking about, socially necessary labor time. But that definition and then the formal use value of money as well, which are both contingent on society. So it's like, what is socially necessary, or like how is that established, and like by whom, like who determines what's socially necessary or necessary for the society as a whole. So and that was an idea that he had, I guess, adapted from Ricardo, because Ricardo talked about the concept of labor time as value, and then he just translated to socially necessary labor time. That was just a little comment I wanted to make.
For sure. So yeah, the quote I wanted to tell you is on page 168, 169 of Capital. It's in chapter 1, and he says, "It is, however, precisely this finished form of the world of commodities, the money form, which conceals the social character of private labor and the social relations between individual workers. By making these relations appear as relations between material things instead of revealing them plainly, if I state, for example, that coats or boots stand in relation to linen because the latter is the universal incarnation of abstract labor, the absurdity of that statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats or boots bring these commodities into relation with linen or gold or silver or any form of money, it makes no difference. As the universal equivalent, the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society appears to them in this exact form." And what I liked about this is that I felt like this passage kind of like illustrates the absurdity of individual private commodity production, right? We're all commonly using the resources of the earth to produce commodities that we all need, but we're kind of forced into these like ridiculous exchanges and forcing to use our mutual social labor in like exchanging them as a form within individual labor. So like, as he states, relations between material objects instead of revealing them plainly. And what I think he means by this is like money hides our mutual social labor. When we go into the grocery store, I think you pointed out earlier, we don't think about how the products got there, who picked the tomatoes, who transported them to the store. We just care about exchanging our labor in the form of the money for those products that we need. Then later, someone else will exchange the money for my labor, right, or product that I'm providing, and they'll use it, to care for their specific need. But in the end, we are all mutually dependent on each other, and the money form hides this. The commodity form of production hides this. So to kind of wrap it all up, the money form essentially creates this fetishism for money and breaks down our social relations. And that's that. I think that was a major point. Is that and I think I was discussing this. I think with my brother or my mother the other day that. What Marx, I think, was trying to point out is that he starts off with like, okay, we've decided to organize our society around commodity production, and let me show you how this decision ends up putting us into these kind of terrible social relations with each other. And one of those things being the exploitive nature of the social relations hiding behind money, which money ends up being this kind of necessary thing that we just talked about, because in order to facilitate this kind of crazy exchange among all these individual producers, we need to create money. But then money creates this fetishism that hides these social relations. So we end up viewing each other not as like people, right? Like doing things. We just saying like, okay, this is a product and I'm just going to exchange my money for it, and I think that's a very important point. And I think that's why sociologists and anthropologists have always I guess appreciated Marx's work because of these kind of, again, going back to these social relations and the cause, what commodity production essentially does to our humanity.
There's a quote in chapter 2 of page 187: with the magic and fetish of money firmly in place, men are henceforth related to each other in their social process of production in a purely atomistic way. Their own relations of production therefore assume a material shape, which is independent of their control and their conscious individual action. So, and then that kind of segues into how Marx viewed as, under capitalism, nobody's necessarily free. Even the capitalists are like, constricted by the laws of the market and the nature of the market. So there is no really freedom under this capitalist system where we're all, constrained by those natural forces of the market. And that's kind of Marx's whole, push for like a communist revolution, I guess, is because of that lack of freedom. And that's contradictory to obviously what people just capitalists or people that are in favor of capitalism, from liberals to conservatives, everybody says, claims that capitalism is free, but in reality, if we're constrained by these, invisible forces, which like Adam Smith pointed out, the invisible hand of the market, that's still like, there's a hand there. That doesn't mean like we're free.
Right.
And that I guess kind of wraps up chapter 2. And that's what he kind of ends on.
Yeah,
right?
That's pretty much it. That's the first 2 chapters. And I think where we kind of wanted to end, at least where I kind of wanted to end, though, was talking about the critiques.
Yeah. Go for it.
I thought it was important to talk about the critiques for the labor theory of value. Originally, like you saw in our reading list, I kind of had this at the end, like at the end of After Capital. But I felt, especially when we decided we were going to tackle this kind of project to bring this knowledge to a wider audience, that we should tackle it at the very beginning, at least some form of it, because, it gets a lot of hate. It gets a lot of hate. It gets a lot of criticism. And I feel like if we don't address it, that's the first thing people are going to, at least the critics, the first thing they're going to jump on is like, you need to throw out Marxism because the labor theory of value shit, and that's it. So I thought, I think we need to talk about it. So I did, a little bit of research on the critiques, and I got 2 different things. One of them is essentially from Keene. Specifically, he wrote I believe he actually wrote his PhD thesis on the labor theory of value and Marx and stuff like that. So the sections, those PDFs that I linked to you guys, I think those are taken from his thesis. So part of it is from that. And then part of it, I found kind of what I'm calling it at least, a neo-Marxist response to Keynes. And then we'll go into that. And then finally, I'm going to end with Keynes. And then, because I think, kind of funnily enough, we talked about this, how like anytime you're reading, and I guess Marx is in many ways a philosophical work on top of being a social theory work and a political economy work. So in any type of philosophy, I think you said this, Jay, at one point, like you read something and then you're like, oh, I'm convinced. And then you find something else and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I don't know about that anymore. So this has kind of happened to me in a very short span. So, and I want to emphasize too for our audience that we're going to definitely revisit this later when we actually get to the surplus value, because we actually haven't talked about surplus value yet. In the first two chapters of Capital, we haven't talked about surplus value. But very briefly, the reason why the labor theory of value gets criticism is because of when Marx gets to the explanations of surplus value, it starts to break down. And very quickly, surplus value is this idea that in production, you end up getting more value than what you put in, right? And that's the source of profits. Because if you hire somebody, this is a very, very simple example, right? But if I have a shoe factory and I hire you, Jason, to make shoes for me for $8 an hour, and then I turn around and I sell them for $12, there's the difference between that $4 is the surplus value, right? Minus the cost of production and the cost of whatever, you end up getting less than that, obviously.
And that's provided I'm making one shoe in an hour. It's not
Right.
to the extent that I'm making like 10 shoes in an hour.
Oh, of course.
And I'm only getting $8 for that 1 hour.
Right. And so, the $4 minus, paying investors minus the costs of production minus whatever that ends up being, let's say it's $2 per shoe, that's profit, right? Where it starts to get criticism is this. So the original form of the labor theory of value is that for whatever reason, Marx only believed that human labor produces surplus value. And again, more value than what is consumed in production is surplus value. That's the original understanding of the labor theory of value. And this gets a lot of heat because, basically the critique is, why can't machines do this too? Why can't machines produce more value than what puts into them? And there's no real good answer to that. Because essentially, I think in Marx's time, machines were kind of viewed almost as tools, but even when you view them as tools, a guy with a hammer making boxes is going to be more productive than a guy without a hammer making boxes, right? And by you using a hammer, you're being more productive, and that productiveness translates into more surplus value, right? So it's flawed philosophically from the very beginning because of that reason, the very simple question of why can't machines do this too? And essentially it gets expanded to, what if we replace all human beings and we're still producing commodities? Those commodities still have surplus value in them, right? And this is expressed in what's called capital-intensive industries, right? Things that don't have a lot of human labor in them. They have mostly a lot of capital investment in machinery and money and technology. So things like telecommunications, automobile manufacturing, refining, steel production, all of those things are very much automated. You think about a modern automotive factory, Tesla or something, you go into their factories, a lot of those things are being run by robots. You know what I mean? And obviously, Tesla is super overvalued now in the stock market. That's a completely different discussion. But still, the point here is that there's very little human labor input into that productive process, but they're generating a lot of money and generating a lot of profit and generating a lot of surplus value in productive commodities. So that in of itself kind of shows there has to be something else to this, right? That these machines have to produce additional value. And so kind of the counter argument against that is like, well, you could kind of say that humans possess kind of special qualities to them, right? Their ingenuity, their creativity, that kind of thing is what's actually producing surplus value. And the neo-Marxist interpretation that I read about this kind of says, look, well, that's still flawed because you can kind of still have this thought experiment, right? Where you say like, well, what if, and again, this is a thought experiment, but like, what if in the future, we create androids and these androids start replacing humans on the factory lines and in our offices and stuff, and they're creative and they're intelligent and, basically have all the same qualities that humans do. why, and they're producing surplus value. You know what I mean? So basically the whole argument is that there's, the main point is that anything that contributes more value to commodity production than it uses up is going to produce surplus value, whether it's a machine, whether it's a robot or the android or whatever. Even when it's like the example I pointed to before, if you're a human making a hammer, you're going to produce more value. You know what I mean? So the whole point there is, you at the end of the day, you have to include machines. You have to include capital into surplus value. So basically, the neo-Marxist answer to that is, all right, we are conceding, absolutely, like machines need to be included into value production, surplus value production. But, and this is the argument, is that ultimately, though, everything produced so far is still the result of earlier human labor.
Right.
So that's basically the argument, is that
you have to create the androids. Like humans have to make the androids, right?
Humans have to make the androids, or to bring it, to a more realistic example, like humans have to create the, those crazy arms that you see in automotive factories that are putting the cars together. Some human back there, created those machines and put them together. So the understanding is that essentially this can be chained all the way back, a long chain of commodity production of like, you created a machine that we use to create other machines that eventually we create other machines for. But at the end of the day, you can keep going back, and the humans eventually put in their labor time to producing machines. So it's kind of a way to say like, hey, at the end of the day, this is still, you can understand machines as just congealed earlier human labor time that we can reuse. And this is another major point, is that the contributions of machines are just delayed or indirect contributions of earlier human labor, and therefore machines can produce more value than go into them, and they allow us to reuse past human labor over and over and over again, right? And that's what produces surplus value. So the example that I'd like to think of is think of a computer program, right? Like if I create a computer program, that's the result of my human ingenuity, my creativity, my labor, but it's out there now, it's a thing, and now people can go and reuse that over and over and over again, right? And therefore, that's the reason why we make machines, right? Is that we create a machine so that we can produce other commodities and eventually produce other machines. If not, why would we do that to begin with?
Yeah, right? the issue, of course, then arises is like, after the androids are created and they're creating the commodities, whatever, the human labor is no longer needed. Then how do humans make a living, basically, right? Like we've created all the machines, they're creating everything we need, and then that's the contradiction. Like then what do we do?
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously we're taking it to its logical conclusion. Then right. It's like, we need to think about these. We need to think about these repercussions. How are we going to continue a commodity production economy that's based upon the not only creation of commodities, but the purchase of those commodities? How is that going to keep happening if people don't have jobs and don't have the money for them to exchange for, right? And that's kind of that whole debate. However, and this is where we're basically wrap up with, there is one major flaw, which I kind of mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, in both neoclassical economics, political economy, and Marxist political economy, that regardless of this kind of reinterpretation or generalized form of the labor theory of value, Keynes still criticizes it because essentially both neoclassical and Marxist economists don't bring energy into the equation, which is an incredible flaw. And the reason for that, and this actually he points out, and again we'll definitely revisit this later, but the physiocrats, which were these group of guys back in these 1700s, were actually the first guys to actually talk about seeing the land as the ultimate source of wealth. And obviously this was an agricultural economy, so they understood that, hey, the sun,
the free energy of the sun,
is the free energy, and it's coming down, hitting the land, and then that energy is stored in the agricultural products that we end up using to feed ourselves, and et cetera, et cetera. And they understood that, though. They understood that, hey, this is coming from somewhere, But Marx and these other guys kind of assume it away. Well, it's the free gifts of nature, and I'm like, it's not necessarily free. Number one, it's not necessarily free. It's subject to depletion and overuse, which is why I think that it's so important to bring energy into the analysis, because it brings those real physical limits. And this is what Keane is basically saying, is that his famous quote is that labor without energy is a corpse, and capital without energy is a sculpture. Without bringing energy, these things are not moving. And it's a very simple concept to understand. Like, you need to consume food, which is basically a form of energy, right, in the form of calories, to get up in the morning, to go to work, and give your brain energy to be creative and make things, or push stuff along an assembly line. And machines need energy in the form of electricity to do the actual things that they do. And therefore, he's saying that it's critical to understand output as really a function of energy being captured and used to facilitate both labor and capital. And that those things, because of that, once you bring energy into the equation, you bring it you establish it in a strong scientific, you give it a strong scientific basis in the form of the laws of thermodynamics, which basically means that, hey, energy can't be created or stored, it can only be captured and reused, and that it's subject to entropy, it's subject to loss. So when your equations, you need to bring in efficiency in there, right? There's only so many calories that you can ingest in a day and transform into work. And there's only so much energy you can capture to push machines before they degrade or pollute or just lose into heat. And these have serious theoretical implications when you bring energy, because again, it puts this physical limitation on growth. Because if now you start having these crazy, basically models that don't include energy, where it's like, whatever, we could just raise capital to whatever, and it doesn't matter. There's no repercussions. We don't have to care about pollution. We don't have to care about where this energy is coming from. It's just there, and that's extremely flawed. And that's pretty much my guess.
I think especially when, I don't know if you agree that it kind of relates to natural resources and using natural resources for just like gas or whatever, or coal, or basing a economy on coal, and then obviously natural resources are constantly depleting, and then we're going to run out of them eventually. I don't know if it really relates back to that, but that's kind of what it makes me think of.
No, yeah, definitely. That is definitely part of bringing the understanding of energy into our theoretical models. Is you start asking yourself those questions. You start asking yourself, okay, where does the energy come from? How are you using it? Is it going to run out? Is it going to cause negative, what bourgeois economists like to call negative externalities that just get written off? You know what I mean? But these things have real implications on the productive process, because if we keep, for example, utilizing fossil fuels, and that generates additional heat in the atmosphere, then suddenly we have to start investing a lot more capital money into weatherizing shit, right? And then that is going to reduce the amount of surplus value that we get, et cetera, et cetera. It has all these real serious implications.